almost died.
She nursed him back from death.
Your shoulder was pretty badly dislocated. It was a little stubborn, but I finally popped it back in.
And now that he's getting better,
Forgive me for prattling away and making you feel all oogie.
she can't bear to see him go.
You and I were meant to be together forever.
Please don't do it.
It's for the best.
Misery.
God, I love you.
Wednesday.
And we're back, like we never left, in the car. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today will mark the 8th entry in our continuing series of Halloween horror. And today's movie is a film that's pretty well remembered by history. It was a box office hit. It got great reviews, and it even, very rare for a horror film, and then again, Silence of the Lambs the following year, but it won, its lead actress won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The film in question is Rob Reiner's very strong adaptation of Stephen King's massive runaway best-selling novel, Misery. Now, Kathy Bates was a significant star on Broadway, and she was supposedly, because I didn't see it, and it's difficult because back then everything wasn't recorded, there was no social media, but we could take it on faith, so to speak, that Kathy Bates, in one of the early iterations of the stage play, Frankie and Johnny, which later was the movie in 1991, the year after Misery, Kathy Bates played one of the leads, and I don't remember the actor who played the Al Pacino part in the movie, Frankie. I'm sorry, Johnny. No, Frankie was the part that was played by Kathy Bates in the stage play, but one of the great things about Hollywood, put the word great in quotes, is that Frankie and Johnny was, the emphasis is that it's two damaged people who don't look like models or movie stars who come together. Kathy Bates is somebody who had a great career on Broadway without having what you would call conventional, girl next door 10 looks. She looks like a normal person. And when they did the movie adaptation of Frankie and Johnny, they cast Al Pacino, who's, he was in his late 40s, maybe he was 50, a very attractive man, and they cast Michelle Pfeiffer. And so as much as you can try to kind of hide how spectacularly attractive Michelle Pfeiffer was she still is now. It's absolutely insane. There are just some people, you look at them and you wonder how's this even possible? And casting Al Pacino and Michelle Pfeiffer in that movie, although I love the movie, it's the opposite of what the play was supposed to be about, of these damaged, unlovable, not really necessarily spectacularly attractive people come together. So Kathy Bates was not that well known in Hollywood and around Hollywood when she was cast in Misery. And it's kind of an important point to note, because you don't know, was Rob Reiner thinking, if we get this right, she's going to be, Oscar nominee, Oscar winner. That's what ended up happening. In 1990, the first year of the greatest movie decade, the 1990s, there were a lot of really solid performances across so many movies, whether it was De Niro in Awakenings and Goodfellas, but he was nominated for Awakenings. It's some of his finest work. A movie called The Grifters, the Stephen Frears film with John Cusack in the lead, but it's really about the actresses. Angelica Houston, who I think was nominated for Best Actress, and Annette Bening, who I'm quite sure was nominated for Supporting Actress. But Kathy Bates, not necessarily that well known, and not somebody who looks like Michelle Pfeiffer, walked away with Best Actress Oscar for her performance as Annie Wilkes in Misery. Now, looking back on the film, if you are not familiar with it, and if you're not like me, who I actually read an awful lot about the history of this movie, because the late, great Oscar-winning author and screenwriter, he did Marathon Man, he did Princess Bride, All the President's Men, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, William Goldman, he was involved very heavily, and he wrote the adaptation of Stephen King's book that was turned into the movie that we're talking about here, Rob Reiner's Misery. Goldman goes into so much detail. He doesn't spend that much time talking about the casting of Kathy Bates. But he goes into, because where I was going with that is, James Caan, he was the father in Elf, he's funny, he did so many different things. The Godfather, obviously, as Sonny Corleone, and a great career and a very distinctive actor, from beginning to end of his career. So there wouldn't be anything that would say, well, there's no way that James Caan was the first choice to play Paul Sheldon, the author of this series of Misery, I think it was Misery Chastain, Misery novels in the world of this Stephen King's book and then the world of the film. But James Caan he wasn't even in the conversation. James Caan was way down on the list of possibilities. And as Goldman goes into painstaking detail in his nonfiction account of really 20 years of his career from like the mid-'80s forward, in this incredible book on Hollywood. You ever want to read a great book on Hollywood? Which Lie Did I Tell by William Goldman, Adventures in the Screen Trade by William Goldman, and the all-time greatest book about how Hollywood works and doesn't work, The Devil's Candy by Julie Salomon, about the ill-fated movie adaptation of Tom Wolfe's extraordinary book, The Bonfire of the Vanities. And the movie had the big hitters. You had Morgan Freeman and Tom Hanks and Bruce Willis and Melanie Griffith. And it just goes to show that having a great literary property like Misery and having big stars like James Caan to some extent, and even Lauren Bacall in a small role is terrific, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But when they were drawing up, and when I say they, I mean Warner Brothers, I mean Castle Rock, Rob Reiner's company, I mean the people who were trying to turn this into a big movie, they were not thinking in any way, shape, or form of James Caan to play the bedridden, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, author Paul Sheldon. Now, I can look back and say that Caan was perfectly cast because he is a very edgy, antsy, aggressive actor. And you saw it in Elf. It could have backfired because the way that he played that character, it could have turned the audience off completely, but you got enough humanity. And that's the thing with Caan. He played a lot of unlikable characters, but at least you could understand why they were the way they were. And in this film, his character is not unlikable. It's one of the more likable leads that James Caan played in his illustrious career. But the first major star that the studio and Rob Reiner went for was Robert Redford. And the thing with Redford, and a lot of people who worked with him said the same thing, if he committed, you got 100% of him. That cut both ways. What that meant was he was a very creative guy. He's an Oscar winner for Ordinary People. He is a great filmmaker. So you're going to get creative input from him. He is not simply going to show up, give him a script, and he's going to read the lines and do what's on the page. It's not going to happen. And Redford had issues with a particular brutal scene, which is in the movie, but it's not nearly as horrifying as what was presented in the book. And in the book, it's simply called a hobbling scene. And that's how William Goldman and the producers and everyone involved in the production of the movie referred to it, where she basically, spoiler alert, let's just say she injures his lower legs. Let's just be diplomatic and we'll call it that. Redford did not want to do that as it was presented. As the script, what Goldman came up with, and Goldman even talked about it in an almost sheepish way. He felt it was some of his best work as far as adapting from a book to a movie, a script, and trying to keep it as cinematic as possible. So Redford really struggled with this. He wanted to do it, but he just couldn't bring himself to this. So he dropped out. And then Warren Beatty, he got involved. And similar to his buddy, Bob Redford, Warren Beatty is also a very creative guy. He is a brilliant man, a terrific filmmaker, also a really talented writer, in addition to being super resourceful as an actor and Hollywood's most iconic and legendary Lothario. Nobody knows what his count is or how many, women in Hollywood he hooked up with, but it's a staggering number. And yet, you very rarely, except for Carly Simon's song, You're So Vain, which everyone's pretty much convinced is about him, Beatty managed to do everything he did, and very few people either took it personally or dragged him or shredded him publicly. There's very little of that. So he must have been a very charming guy, that there weren't that many people who were sore at him or had, permanently hurt feelings, aside from presumably Carly Simon. And Beatty was heavily involved, and then he backed out. More or less for the same reason, this one scene and then its effect on the rest of the movie where he just wasn't comfortable doing it. So he and Redford both ended up bailing for the same reason. That's how James Caan got the part. The studio intended to have a major, not just a star, but a generational figure in cinema in either Redford or Beatty. And it didn't work out, so they just settled on a great actor who had that kind of almost James Woods edgy, aggressive screen persona. And to play somebody who is mostly bedridden, it would seem to go against James Caan's strengths as an actor, but I believe that he was perfectly cast. And I love Redford, and I'm a huge Beatty fan. I don't think the movie would work as well, because then it becomes a film about a movie star. And that was one of the all-time great quotes, Scott Rudin, when he made Up Close and Personal with Robert Redford 5 years later, and Michelle Pfeiffer, who I mentioned earlier. It started off to be a biographical film about the famous female kind of trailblazing, pioneering telejournalist, Jessica Savage, and it ended up not even being a true story. They just had a romance about two people in the news business. And when people said, well, what the hell happened to the Jessica Savage thing? They said, we just decided to make a film about two movie stars. Up Close and Personal, a film about two movie stars. And Misery, if you have the kind of dynamic screen presence of Robert Redford, the smile, I don't think that he and Kathy Bates, I don't think that it works. And I surely don't think that Beatty's charm and Beatty's, the way that you can see him, the gears, the calculation in his head, because he's a much broader and he has far more range than Robert Redford. Robert Redford is more of a classical movie star. Beatty is a great actor who ended up being a brilliant writer, great director, and a movie star. I don't think the movie works nearly as well with either of the big hitters. It feels like they settled for Caan, but I think that he should have been the choice all along. That's neither here nor there. The film benefits from great casting in the smaller roles. And you had Frances Sternhagen, who I believe had gotten an Oscar nomination a couple of years earlier. Was she in Mississippi Burning? I'm not sure about that. But I'm confident that Frances Sternhagen was an Oscar nominee at some point in the 80s. I hate to say it, I sometimes get confused, even though they look nothing alike, between Frances Sternhagen and Brenda Fricker. Maybe they were nominated the same year. But the late, great, amazing supporting character actor, Richard Farnsworth, in Misery, he brings so much to the table in a pretty small role as a kind of local sheriff. But man, that guy was great. Speaking of Redford, he's amazing in Barry Levinson. Speaking of Warren Beatty, Bugsy. In Barry Levinson's The Natural, Richard Farnsworth plays kind of like a bench coach for the New York Knights, the team that Robert Redford's Roy Hobbs ends up playing for. And there are certain actors, without chewing scenery, where every single line reading feels significant. Richard Farnsworth was one of those actors where, whether it was his face, whether it was his eyes, whether it was the way with his body language, but every line reading that Richard Farnsworth has in The Natural is magic. And every line reading that he has in Misery is also magic. And what the film does, and I don't know if this is in the book, my father was a big fan of the book. He actually saw Misery in theaters. I think it was December of 1990, November, December. I mean, I know it was, late in the year. My dad loved the book. He saw the movie in theaters, and he said the movie was almost as good as the book. And for my dad, that was high praise indeed. He thought they nailed it. And he made special mention to tell me, hey, the guy that plays Red in The Natural, Richard Farnsworth, is so good in this film. But what Rob Reiner does with that character, he's a sheriff. He's a serious guy. He's not a clown. He's not a comic relief character or figure of fun. But the relationship that he has with his wife in the movie is very playful, and it almost puts you, this is a mild spoiler, it almost puts you at ease. Because there's a running gag about the fact that they've been together for decades, and yet they still have the kind of comic antagonism of two people who may bicker, but who love each other to pieces. And where the character played by Richard Farnsworth ends up is not what we expect. And it's to the film's credit, because we see a lot of times where they don't take those level of chances. And in this film, this is also a bit of a spoiler, the hobbling scene, the irony is they ended up listening to Redford and Beatty, who said, this is a bad idea. You shouldn't do this. Not in this movie. They ended up not doing what they originally intended. And again, if what ended up in the film, if Redford had been told you can do this, he would have made the movie. And the same with Beatty. So they ended up punting both of those guys punted the project, and Khan came in, and then they ended up not doing the scene the way that they were going to do it and the way that they stood on their head until Redford and Beatty bailed. But the idea is Reiner was true to the book as far as the character of the sheriff, and Richard Farnsworth is so strong he could have gotten a Best Supporting Actor nomination. I guess they felt the part just wasn't big enough, but boy does he hit a home run in that role. But the movie, I don't find it scary. I just think it's a terrific film. This isn't that kind of movie that would frighten me. And Stephen King certainly has had supernatural, whether it's The Shining and the differences between the book and the movie and all of that. But this is just, to me, a great claustrophobic psychological thriller. And I mean, I guess, as I've talked about, when it comes to genre and it comes to horror movies, I have a bit of a different interpretation because of, my schooling and the complex discovery plot and all of this, because this movie doesn't follow any complex discovery plot. This is not that kind of horror movie. This is a very interior story. It's closer to Silence of the Lambs in terms of the body horror and the horror of the mind. I know that's a cliche, but that's what's presented to us. So right now, Misery is on, I'm almost 100% certain it's on Max. It's been on Netflix. It's been free with Amazon Prime at various points, but I don't think that it's free with Prime anymore, but I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find it on streaming. One of the kind of ironies is the way that it works, and people 20 years ago didn't imagine it was going to be this. But you have a number of movies where, let's say, two big studios kind of split the freight. So you could have a situation where a film was co-produced, or it may have been financed by Warner but distributed by Paramount, and then when it comes to streaming, you say, well, which of them get dibs? Well, I don't know. One might have to pay the other a lot of money, or maybe not. But Misery is a film that, as I say, is very well remembered by history, and I don't know anybody who doesn't really like this film, whether or not they say, oh my God, it's so scary, or whether it's just, this is a great movie, because there's really no way to guess how it's going to turn out. There aren't any particular markers. Again, it doesn't follow the standard protocols of a horror film with onset, a killer is doing terrible things. Discovery, we discover that a killer of some sort, supernatural origin, alien, is doing terrible things. Then you have the one character that says there's nothing extraterrestrial or supernatural going on, and then that character is finally convinced that yes, there is, and then confrontation. This could almost have been, and I'm sure it's been done off Broadway. I don't think it was done on Broadway, but this is a claustrophobic enough story where it could just be a stage play. And maybe that's part of why Kathy Bates hit such a home run, because it felt like a two-character play. Most of this movie is James Caan and Kathy Bates and no one else. I would say at least 60% of the movie is that. And somehow it all works because those two actors had enormous chemistry together. And I don't mean like, oh, they're hot for one another, but the line readings and the way that James Caan relates to her and the way that Kathy Bates as Annie, she's bent, she's completely crazy, but even her crazy is not what you expect because it's inconsistent. And I like that because the reality is if somebody is truly crazy, you're not going to be able to predict every bit of their behavior. And why not? Because they're crazy. You can't guess what a psychopath, a true psychopath, you can't guess what a true sociopath is going to do simply because you give them an armchair diagnosis. Now, there is a moment towards the end of the film, this is a mild spoiler, where Lauren Bacall, what an amazing presence. Lauren Bacall. They're just certain people, when you know the history of them, anytime they show up on screen, it's a treat. And Lauren Bacall plays Paul Sheldon, that's James Caan's character. She plays Paul Sheldon's agent. I don't think she's his lawyer. I think she's his agent. But there is a moment in the film, it's the only time there is even the slightest hint of the supernatural, where James Caan is in a restaurant, he's chilling, whatever, and Lauren Bacall, they're schmoozing, they're talking about his book or whatever it might be, and he has I don't know if you would call it a flashback or a memory fragment or a bit of a short circuit in his brain, but this is something that's true, that you might have a moment where somebody who meant an awful lot to you at a certain time in your life, for good, for bad, or as in the case of Paul Sheldon, for very ugly. And he is convinced that he sees her and just as quickly realizes that's not her. That's as close as this movie gets to a jump scare, in my opinion. And thing is, because we have seen movies and we saw films such as Fatal Attraction literally cheat from a narrative perspective where you have a character who is dead. This character is dead and then suddenly is not dead. So with the previous knowledge that maybe all bets are off, that jump scare, I guess it could have been her. It's a moment that also could have backfired, but I believe works really well. And the kind of weight of the experiences that James Caan's Paul Sheldon has gone through, it's written all over his face in the scene with Lauren Bacall. It's really some of Caan's best acting. And I'm just glad that it all worked out the way that it did. Movie probably would have been a bigger hit had it been Redford, had it been Beatty. And I could almost imagine, not so much Redford, but I could have imagined a scenario where they would have tried to get Beatty an Oscar nomination, because that's the kind of role that from a craftsmanship, from a technical acting perspective, he would have been terrific. I just don't think the movie would have been as good with him in that role. And Beatty, when he kind of ducked out of Misery, he recommitted again for about the third or fourth time to Barry Levinson's Bugsy, which for my money is every bit as good a gangster film as Goodfellas. Totally different movie, and it doesn't have those kind of repeatable where everybody knows the lines. How am I funny? Am I a clown? It doesn't really have those moments, but it's fantastic. And Beatty ended up getting an Oscar nomination for Bugsy. And if you ask me, I love Anthony Hopkins, but it's a supporting performance in Silence of the Lambs. Warren Beatty in Bugsy, it is an extraordinary film performance. He's just incredible in that movie. So basically, it all worked out. What could have been disastrous with big actor A dropping out in Redford and big actor B dropping out in Warren Beatty, big actor C in Jimmy Caan, ended up being exactly what this particular story that Rob Reiner was trying to tell, adapted from Stephen King's bestseller, it's what it needed. Misery, the 8th entry in our continuing series of Halloween horror. Directed by Rob Reiner from a book by Stephen King and starring James Caan, Kathy Bates, Francis Sternhagen, and the extraordinary Richard Farnsworth. This has been episode 330 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.